There was always that one chair, not in the middle of things, but somewhere off to the side, where the lighting was bad and the noise didn't quite reach. That was my seat. At family events, I'd quietly show up, bring something homemade, offer to help. Somehow, I always ended up being the one taking the pictures instead of being in them. No one ever said, "Come sit by me," or asked about my life. I was just there. Pleasant, helpful, invisible. I used to think maybe I just wasn't interesting enough, that maybe my stories didn't measure up to my cousins' tales of promotions or fancy vacations. So I stayed quiet. I smiled at the right times, nodded through the small talk, and left feeling like a ghost who had walked through a room full of people without anyone noticing the chill. My presence was convenient but never meaningful. What they never saw was what I was building behind the scenes. While they brushed me off with, "She's sweet, but not really impressive," I was laying brick after brick of something real. A business, a name, a life on my own terms. They saw me as background. I was building my own center stage. It's strange how early it starts, the quiet erasure. I remember being a teenager and hearing my aunt rave about my cousin's science award while barely glancing at the scholarship letter I had brought. "Oh, that's nice, honey," she'd said, already turning to ask someone else to pass the potatoes. I learned to tuck my wins away like secrets. Nobody clapped, nobody asked questions, so I stopped sharing. Birthdays came and went with short, last-minute messages, if they remembered at all. When I graduated top of my class, they asked me to help set the table. I had just landed my first big client when one of them casually said, "You still working that little side thing?" I smiled. That's what they called my company, a little side thing. They had no idea it was keeping more than just me afloat, but I didn't correct them. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. I figured if they were comfortable thinking I was small, I wouldn't interrupt that illusion. Instead, I poured everything into building something solid, something that didn't need their applause. And each time they overlooked me, I added another layer of quiet strength to the foundation they couldn't see. There were moments, I'll admit, when the silence stung more than I let on. Like when I overheard my uncle say, "Camille's nice, but let's be honest, she's never been the ambitious type." I wanted to laugh, or maybe scream, but I didn't do either. I just swallowed it, like I had so many times before, and let it settle into the same place where all the other dismissals lived. I started saying no to invitations, not out of anger, but out of clarity. If being present didn't make me visible, what was the point of showing up? I chose instead to invest my time where I was seen, where I didn't have to shrink myself to make others comfortable. I surrounded myself with clients, partners, and friends who respected my voice, not because it was loud, but because it mattered. And as I sat quietly at those tables for years, what they didn't know was that I was watching, taking mental notes, learning who clapped only when the spotlight was on them. They thought I didn't have much to say, but I was just saving my voice for the day it would finally echo. The whispers started slow. A cousin lost his job, something about downsizing. Another had a failed investment that no one could have seen coming, except everyone kind of did. I heard about it through relatives who never used to remember my name, but now suddenly asked how I was doing. Not in a warm way, in a calculating, hesitant tone, like someone knocking on a door they once ignored. It was surreal. The same people who once asked me to take their coats at dinner were now fumbling through small talk, slipping in questions like, "So, you're still running that business, right?" with a thin smile and nervous eyes. I didn't say much. I just nodded and sipped my coffee, waiting for the moment they'd stop pretending and finally ask what they came to ask. Eventually they did. One by one they came, some embarrassed, others entitled. There were stories of debt, of mortgage payments, of needing just a little help to get through a rough patch, and though they danced around the words, I knew what they wanted. Money, the kind they once doubted I could ever make. I listened. Really listened. Not to the numbers or the desperate promises, but to the tone, the entitlement under the desperation. They weren't just asking for help. They were assuming I would say yes, as if I owed it to them. As if years of being overlooked were suddenly erased by their misfortune. Family helps family, one of them said, like it was some sacred truth they had always lived by. I wanted to ask where that sentiment was when I was celebrating milestones alone, or when I sat through dinners hearing about everyone else's success while they barely acknowledged mine. But I didn't. I smiled, said I'd think about it, gave them tea and asked if they wanted anything sweet. It was strange, watching the ones who never saw me suddenly need me to look at them. And beneath it all, I felt something unexpected. Peace. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I had mourned their absence long ago. What I felt now was certainty. The kind that comes from knowing your value doesn't hinge on someone else finally recognizing it. I didn't need their praise, and I didn't need to say yes. The day they all came over, it felt like a reunion from a life I had already outgrown. They brought pastries, smiles too wide, voices too careful. I served coffee like I always had, quiet, generous, but this time, the room felt different. Not because they had changed, but because I had. They weren't looking at me the way they used to. For once, they were paying attention. Still, I noticed how they tried to steer the conversation. Casual comments about how proud they were of me, how they'd always known I had it in me. Lies, all of them, wrapped in sugar. And when the moment finally came, when the real reason for the visit surfaced, I just listened. No interruptions, no raised brows, just silence where my validation used to live. They thought I would jump at the chance to be needed, that I'd feel honored to be the solution after years of being the afterthought. But what they forgot is that I never needed to be seen by them to see myself clearly. They remembered I existed only when they needed something I had. I invited them back a few days later. Same living room, same quiet hospitality. But something in the air had shifted, and I think they felt it too. They came in hopeful, maybe even a little smug, convinced I'd come around, that I'd play the dutiful cousin, the loyal niece, the grateful girl who finally got her moment and would now give back. I let them speak. Each one took their turn, weaving their hardships into stories that tiptoed between tragedy and manipulation. "It's just this once," said one. "You know we've always been close," said another, as if proximity had ever meant connection. I nodded, refilled their cups, offered them cookies. I gave them comfort while they rehearsed desperation. And when the last voice trailed off, when all their needs had been laid bare on my table like a potluck of problems, I looked each of them in the eye and said, calmly, clearly, "I'm afraid I can't help you." Not out of cruelty, not even out of pride, just truth. The kind I had held in for years. At first there was silence, a stunned, breath-holding kind of silence. Then came the attempts, some subtle, others not. One cousin leaned in and said, "Come on, Camille, don't be like that." Another tried guilt. "After everything we've done for you?" I almost laughed. Everything they'd done for me? Like forgetting my birthday 10 years in a row? Or calling my work a hobby while I pulled 12-hour days building something from nothing? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just stood, looked around the room, and spoke with the same stillness they had always mistaken for weakness. "You taught me something valuable," I said. "That in this family, love is a currency, and I was always broke. You made me feel like a shadow. And now that I've made something of myself, you want to cash in on a bond you never nurtured." Some of them scoffed. Others looked away, but none of them argued. Deep down, they knew. They knew they hadn't shown up. Not when it mattered. Not when it counted. And now they were being met with the kind of silence that speaks louder than any scream. They didn't leave right away. Some lingered, waiting for me to soften. One even muttered, "You've changed." And they were right. I had. I was no longer the girl who bit her tongue just to keep the peace. I had spent too many years swallowing disappointment, hoping one day I'd earn a place in their eyes. That day never came. So I gave myself what they never did: respect. I walked them to the door with the same grace I always had, but this time it wasn't out of habit. It was a boundary drawn with clarity, a line they never thought I'd have the power to draw. As they stepped outside, one turned and asked, "Is this really what you want? To turn your back on family?" I smiled, not bitterly, just honestly, and said, "No, I'm just finally facing the truth." They didn't see it then, but I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn love from people who only noticed me when they wanted something. I wasn't shrinking or apologizing or folding myself small. I didn't raise my voice. I just raised the standard. It didn't take long for the story to spread. One cousin told another, who told a sibling, who told a parent. And just like that, the woman they used to forget became the topic of every hushed phone call and passive-aggressive comment at Sunday lunch. But they didn't talk about what they had done, only what I had refused. The narrative twisted like it always had. Camille's cold now. She's selfish. She's forgotten where she came from. But over time, something shifted. The outrage faded, and in its place came a quieter kind of discomfort. Old photos surfaced, the kind that had been buried in drawers or left half-developed in dusty albums. And there I was, always behind someone, always cut off at the edge. The background blur they never thought twice about. It started to dawn on them, slowly, painfully, that maybe I hadn't been cold. Maybe I'd just been forgotten. Messages were reread, invitations never answered, texts seen and ignored. My absence, once unnoticed, now echoed loudly in their lives, and for the first time, they had to sit with the truth of it. I wasn't being cruel. I had simply stopped waiting to be seen. Some tried to justify it. We didn't mean to exclude her. She was always so quiet. But deep down they knew. I had been right there year after year, showing up, helping, listening, and they had chosen not to look. It wasn't that I was invisible. It's that they refused to focus their eyes, and now, with their problems laid bare and no easy solution in sight, they were finally seeing the shape of the silence they had helped create. Meanwhile, my life moved forward. I wasn't flaunting it, just living. The business grew. I took trips. I laughed louder. I surrounded myself with people who didn't wait for crisis to value connection. I had a new kind of family now, chosen, not assigned. People who saw me, heard me, celebrated me without needing a reason, and that, more than anything, is what stung the ones I left behind. Because they weren't just missing my money, they were missing the comfort of my presence, the stability I brought to every room without being asked. The way I remembered birthdays, made room at the table, offered help without hesitation. They were missing something they had never bothered to truly know. I never said a word to correct the stories they told about me. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of settling in without my help. It whispered through old voicemails they never returned, lingered in photos where I was the only one not smiling, echoed in the emptiness they felt when they realized I wasn't coming back around. The guilt wasn't loud. It was slow and steady, like a faucet dripping in the middle of the night. Impossible to ignore once you're finally alone. Some of them tried again, softer this time. Messages that started with, "just checking in," and ended with, "we miss you." But there was no invitation, no ownership, just a vague attempt to feel better without doing the work. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but self-respect. They had years to care. I had spent those years learning how to stop needing them to. And in the quiet they left behind, I found a kind of peace they still hadn't earned. I walked through rooms where my name was spoken with warmth instead of hesitation. I was no longer the extra place setting, the afterthought. I had become a presence that no longer needed their permission. They began to miss what they never took the time to know. I never wanted revenge. That would have meant they still had power over me. What I wanted, what I chose, was legacy. Not the kind carved into gravestones, but the kind that lives in classrooms, in community centers, in whispered thank yous from people who finally felt seen. I started funding scholarships in my hometown, mentoring young women who reminded me of myself, bright, quiet, overlooked. I poured into them everything I had once needed and never received. My name began to surface in places where they least expected it, not in gossip, but in gratitude. People spoke of me with respect, even admiration. And those who once dismissed me, They had to hear it. Over and over again. Camille helped my daughter. Camille built this. Camille changed that. Not loud, not flashy, just constant. Quiet waves reshaping the shore they thought would never move. Then one day, a message came through. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. No excuses, no stories, just a line that caught my breath. I was wrong. I'm sorry. You deserved so much more from us. I read it twice. Not because I needed to believe it, but because it meant they finally did. I sat with that message for a long time. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I finally had the freedom to choose whether I wanted to. There was no more ache behind their words, no more craving for validation. I had already given myself everything they hadn't: love, pride, a sense of belonging. So I wrote back simply, I know I did, and I gave that to myself. There was power in that, not defiance, not bitterness, just truth, and it felt cleaner than forgiveness ever could, because I wasn't interested in fixing what had been broken. I was too busy building something better. They had every chance to be part of my story when it was being written in pencil. Now that it was inked in bold, they didn't get to rewrite it with apologies, and I think that's when it finally sank in, for them at least. That I was no longer the one waiting at the edges of the room, hoping to be noticed. I had become the woman whose absence could silence an entire dinner table. The one whose name carried more than just memories. It carried proof of what happens when the invisible one decides to stop waiting for permission to shine. I don't know if they ever sat together and talked about what they did. Not really. But I imagine they feel it, each in their own way. In the silence when my name comes up. In the hesitation when they tell stories that I'm no longer a part of. In the way they glance at old photos and realize I'm not behind the camera anymore. I'm just not there at all. My absence didn't create drama. It created space. Space they don't know how to fill. And yet, I don't carry hate. I don't replay the old slights like I used to. What I carry now is clarity. I remember who I was, the girl in the background, always trying to be enough. And I honor her by being the woman who no longer needs to prove herself to anyone. That's the twist they never saw coming. I didn't need revenge. I became whole. Once upon a time, I was the quiet one in the corner. The girl no one bothered to ask about. The one who watched, waited, and wondered if she'd ever be truly seen. And now? My absence fills every room they enter. Not because I disappeared, but because I finally decided where I belonged.